This is Gene Monterastelli, and welcome to the Tapping Q&A podcast recorded live to tape from Williamsburg in Brooklyn. This is episode 291, originally aired November 8th, 2017. Hi, everyone. I hope this finds you well wherever you are and whatever time of day you're getting a chance to listen to this. Thanks for spending some time with me today. Today, we're going to have a conversation about how it is possible on a genetic level that trauma can be passed from previous generations and what we can do about that. Before we jump into that, I wanted to let you know that we have a free 10-part guide on how you can use tapping to eliminate self-sabotage. All you need to do is go to tappingqa.com, click on the big blue button, and every few days I will send you another part. I don't want to overwhelm you. This way you get useful pieces of information a little bit at a time that you can start to implement right away. And when you do this, what you will notice is you are starting to take the action you want to take, and you're going to do it in a way that you're doing it efficiently. So not only are you doing more stuff, you're doing it in less time, so you will be more productive in whatever you are trying to do. Tappingqa.com, click on the big blue button. If you happen to be listening to this on the website, all you need to do is go up to the top of the right-hand column, click on the big blue button, and you will get that information right away. Today I have a conversation with Mark Wolynn. Mark has dedicated his time and his work to looking at how trauma is passed along on a genetic level, actually inside of our DNA, and how someone could have a traumatic experience in one generation and it shows up for us in another generation. Mark has also spent a lot of time on figuring out how we can undo that and release that trauma, even if it isn't our particular experience. So 2 things to note before we jump into this interview. The first is the work Mark does is really technical on a biological level, but the conversation we have here, I think he did a really good job of explaining it in layman's terms. Because at the beginning of the conversation, I didn't know any of this, so I asked really basic questions. So even if you have no experience with DNA and genetics, you're going to be able to dive into this really easily, and you're going to get a lot out of it. The second thing is, after the interview, I want you to stick around because I'm going to spend a little time unpacking what he shared and talk about how specifically, based on this information, we can use tapping to release these traumas that have been passed along to us. Oftentimes with these interviews, I know that people hear the music at the end of the interview and they hop out because they're just announcements after the fact. But this time I want you to stick around because I've just some really specific approaches that you can use right away with your tapping in response to this amazing information. So here is my conversation with Mark about genetics, trauma, and how we can receive trauma from other generations. So in the work that I do, I spend a lot of time working with my clients about the beliefs about themselves and beliefs about the world. And it's really easy for my clients to see when they have been given a specific belief by one of their parents. A parent says something over and over again. This is the way they describe the world. Because we live in that space, we naturally pick up those beliefs. The work that you do is about something different. It's about the way that we can take trauma and experiences from our parents and generations before us in a different way. Could you just kind of frame that for the listeners so they kind of know what you're doing that is different from what I've just described?
Absolutely. My work helps to explain the mysteries we live with, the unexplained fears, the anxieties, the depression that strikes suddenly, the depression we never get to the bottom of. We have symptoms, but I've discovered that they may not be ours. So like the title of the book, It Didn't Start With You. These symptoms could be the residues of traumas in our family history that we've biologically inherited from our parents and grandparents. Symptoms we think are ours, but again, they didn't start with us.
And so you use an interesting word there. You use the word biological. And so that implies this very specific thing that's being passed down through our biology and our genes. Is that something that is something that we can actually quantify and see, or how do we know something like that is a possibility?
So for that, we have to look at the nature of trauma. When a trauma happens, it changes us in several ways. Literally, it causes a chemical change in our DNA. And this changes how our genes function, sometimes for generations gene. So technically, after a trauma, there can be a chemical signal or chemical tag. They call it an epigenetic tag. They can attach to the DNA and tell the cell to use or to ignore a certain gene if it's going to be helpful for our survival. And then the way the genes are affected, this changes how we act or feel. For example, we can become reactive to situations that are similar to the original trauma. You know, the original trauma I'm talking about that goes back a generation or two, so that we can deal with it better. And then these gene changes, as we're now learning, these can be transmitted to our children. I'll give you an example of how this might work. If our grandparents, for example, came from a war-torn country, they could pass forward a skill set of sharper reflexes and quicker reaction times to help us survive the trauma they experienced. The problem is we can also inherit a stress response with the dials set to 10, prepared for a catastrophe, which never arrives because we're not living in that same stressed environment. And then the continuous stress can be harmful for our bodies. And it's these gene changes, which are the culprit, which we're now learning, that are transmitted to our children, can even go further than that to our children's children. So, yeah.
And so what I hear in that, just because I have a ninth grade level in biology and understanding and how genes work, because oftentimes when we think of genes, or at least those of us who have a basic education in science, we think, well, my genes give me blue eyes and my genes make me 6'1" and they impact me in that way.
Right.
What you're saying is that other things that are impacted genetically are the way that we interact in the world. So it's almost like we are given this toolbox about how we perceive information and how the biochemistry of our body responds to that. And inside of that, it can change and evolve, that we have learned how to be afraid of danger. And that is a good thing. But when we have these extreme experiences, we're almost over-learning a lesson about what is dangerous. And because we're not in that situation anymore, that part of us is over-functioning because our genes are telling us we need to be more on guard than we actually do.
Well put, Gene. So our children aren't always born with that clean hard drive, and we're not always born with a clean hard drive. We used to think that there'd be a sort of a nullification process or an erasure process, and once a child is born, it comes as a tabula rasa, a clean slate.
Right.
But we find more or less there's an operating system that's already in place, one that contains the fallout from our parents' traumas, our grandparents' traumas, maybe even our great-grandparents' traumas. And then our children can be born with fears and feelings. That's us, that can be born with fears and feelings that don't always belong to us, which is one of the reasons I wrote the book, so people can make that link and break the cycle.
And what I think something that is so important inside of that, certainly with the types of clients I work with and the protocols I work within, we spend a significant amount of time trying to find our way to an initial sensitizing event. So we can find this place where it was knit into us so that we can go and undo it. And I know certainly a number of my clients get really frustrated when we're not able to find something like that. And so they become obsessed with, just finding the initial sensitizing event almost to the detriment to doing the things about the healing process, and to have this information that gives us permission to know maybe there's an essential sensitizing event in our experience, or maybe there's not and it came before us, I could see as being a liberating thing, at least in a transformational and a healing process.
Right. And sometimes it doesn't come before us. Sometimes that initial event is so early we don't really have access to it.
Right.
It would be before, it would be in utero or during the first 3 years of our life, where the hippocampus hasn't fully developed its connections to the prefrontal cortex. So we can't cognitively remember it, but physiologically, we remember. The midbrain remembers that the amygdala is still chiming or overreacting whenever there's a similar sensory experience or a similar experience where our body knows something about this feeling of being left, or this feeling of being alone, or this feeling of not being attended to. But it could track back to an in uterine experience where our mom and dad are separating, or they're not getting along, or someone's cheating, someone's drinking, and our mom's attention is pulled from attuning to us internally and is pulled to the trauma. And that creates a different trauma for us of where did she go? What happened? And so sometimes that early event isn't in a generation prior, but it's in our own lives. I just want to make that clear.
Yeah.
So we know that we're not always working in this work with generational trauma, that sometimes we're working with our own early trauma as well.
Yeah. And so when I know that, again, from just a brief studying of genetics, that there are sometimes things that express themselves genetically because of the genetics that we have in the environment that we are in. It's not just a genetic predisposition, but it's almost like that part of the genetic code needs to be activated by something that is environmental. When we're dealing with these sorts of traumas that could be passed along generationally, is it something that is with us all of the time because it's there, or is it something that's in the genetic code and something we could bump into that's going to activate it, and we're now dealing with this trauma that's passed along generationally but is just showing up now today?
Perhaps both.
Okay.
Perhaps it's been with us, but it needs the trigger event. I can explain it talking about, they did this interesting study at Emory University, Emory Medical School in Atlanta, mm-hmm. where they traumatized male mice in a particular way. And, I'll explain. It's not a long study. I'll just explain what happened.
Yes, please.
They took male mice and they made them fear a cherry blossom scent. And the way they did that is every time the mice would experience smelling this cherry blossom scent, they would shock the mice. And right away they found changes in the blood, in the brain, and in the sperm. For example, in the brain, there would be enlarged areas where greater amount of smell receptors existed. So that mice could detect the scent at lesser concentrations. So their brains right away have adapted epigenetically to protect them. There's this epigenetic adaptation that's protective to help them survive. If I can smell this scent even sooner, then I can brace. I can brace myself, prepare myself. So they take, since the changes are also in the blood and in the sperm, they take some of the sperm from these shocked mice that have smelled the cherry blossom scent, and they impregnate females that were not shocked. And what they find in the second and third generations was absolutely startling. That the mice became jumpy, the pups and the grandpups became jittery and jumpy just by smelling the smell and not being shocked. So they had inherited the stress response. Wow. Without directly experiencing the trauma. So the trigger event is the smell, which may have been with them all along, dormant in a sense, until the trigger event is experienced. And I find that to be true in humans as well. You see, the reason we study mice is we can observe these changes in humans for 2 generations, and I'll talk about some of the human studies as well. But the reason that we work with mice is we can get a generation more quickly.
Right.
In 12 to 20 weeks, you get another generation. For humans, it's 12 to 20 years. And mice share 90% of a similar genetic makeup as humans. So that means that 99% of the genes in mice have genes in humans have counterparts in mice, with about 80% being identical. So that makes mice and rats a perfect laboratory ground with which to look at some of these epigenetic changes.
And so when we're looking at these things that are being passed epigenetically, how many generations back is it possible for these things to be passed along?
So the research suggests that the effects of trauma can be transmitted for at least 3 generations. Now, there's some studies saying 3 generations. Recently, I saw a study that showed 4. There's studies with worms where they can see the epigenetic effect for 14 generations. But there's an interesting study with mice done in the Brain Institute at the Brain Research Institute at the University of Zurich in 2014 that showed that traumatized male mice that were repeatedly separated from their mothers and would have trauma because of which, afterwards, after they're separated, of course, they're exhibiting a depression-like symptom, or something we would call depression in humans. And the pups in the 2nd generation would have this experience, and the pups in the 3rd generation would have this experience. But they looked at some of the genetic material that was passed forward. And while the same trauma symptoms were experienced despite never having experienced the trauma themselves, researchers found abnormally high numbers of microRNAs, this genetic material that regulates gene changes, in the blood and brain. They find it in that 1st generation. They find it in the 2nd generation. And although the mice in the 3rd generation are experiencing the same symptoms as their fathers and grandfathers, the elevated numbers of the microRNAs are not detected in the 3rd generation, leading the researchers to speculate that these behavioral changes, these behavioral effects can be transmitted perhaps for 3 generations, but perhaps not beyond that. So the jury's still out. The science is still coming, and that's the beauty of this work. We're looking at biologically inherited traumas, which is brand new. 12 years ago, we weren't thinking in this direction. Although scientists had long suspected something like this gene, it wasn't until about 12 years ago that a neuroscientist from Mount Sinai Medical out of New York named Rachel Yehuda discovered that the children of Holocaust survivors shared the same trauma symptoms, specifically the low levels of cortisol. The cortisol, that's the stress hormone that helps us get back to normal after a stressful event. She finds that the children of the Holocaust survivors are having the same trauma symptoms as their parents. And she, specifically the anxiety, the depression, the hypervigilance. And then she finds a similar pattern in the children who were born to mothers who were pregnant who were pregnant at or near the World Trade Center when it was attacked during 9/11. And then she, just last year, technically 2 years ago, she finds that survivors and their children share the exact same gene changes in the exact same region of the exact same gene, which suggests that traumas are heritable. She goes on to say that you and I are 3 times more likely to have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder if one of our parents had PTSD. And as a result, we're likely to struggle with anxiety or depression.
And so as we hear this and kind of process all of these ways that this stuff can be passed along, I'm sure, because biology seems to always have a way, that there's a positive for something like this being passed along generationally. Is that the case? Are there things beyond trauma that, like, what else is being passed on in a similar way where it's being tagged onto the genetics as it's being passed along?
The skill of adaptation. So we're learning to adapt, which is both positive and can be negative. But for example, this skill set of being very savvy, or, a vet returns from Iraq or Vietnam, and he's developed a skill set that is it can be disastrous at one level. But at another level, who would you like to be hanging out with if catastrophe happens? Because he's got a very defined or highly sensitized skill set that can tell us what to do and help us to know what to do when tragedy strikes. So it's not just negative. These adaptive changes, these adaptive skill sets can be beneficial in helping us survive.
And so I guess, and this is a phrase that I come back to again and again, is the idea isn't that these responses are bad. It's we want to make sure that the responses we have are well-informed and proportionate. And as long as they're well-informed and proportionate, they become useful. The instant they're misinformed or they're disproportionate, that's the place that we start running into trouble.
And that's exactly where our work comes in. You and I are working with people who can't understand why all of a sudden they have symptoms or anxiety that strikes suddenly and didn't exist prior to an event. I once, I always tell people, they say, are there signs of trauma, or they're signs of inherited trauma? And I say, yeah, we might experience a fear or an anxiety or a symptom that strikes suddenly when we have one of these triggering events, or even when we reach a certain age that is the triggering event, or we hit a certain milestone in our lives, like we get married or we go to have kids, and it's as though there's an ancestral alarm clock that starts ringing inside us. We get married, or we have a child, or we get rejected by a partner, or we move to a place, and then suddenly there's a feeling that goes off in our body that wasn't there before. I once worked with this woman who, she was consumed with anxiety, Gene. And that's all she knew. She had terrible anxiety, and we had to pull back some of the layers until we found that the anxiety showed up as soon as she became a new mother. And now that she's a new mother, she's living with this terrible fear that she could harm her baby. Now, she doesn't have this before she's a new mother, but the fear is that she'll do something terrible and her baby will die. So I ask her the obvious question, had you ever been pregnant? Had you ever harmed a baby? She goes, no. And it was her first pregnancy. And so I said, did anyone in your family ever harm her baby? And she said, she was about to say no. And then all of a sudden it jogged her memory. And she said, oh, my grandmother, when she was a young woman, a young mother, she had a baby, and she was lighting a candle, and the candle caught the curtains on fire and then caught the house on fire. And the baby was upstairs, and she tried to put the fire out, but by the time she was trying to run upstairs, the fire was everywhere. And she couldn't get her baby out, and the baby died. And then she said, but we were never allowed to talk about it. And that's where I learned that a lot of these traumas, our grandparents, our parents won't mention. And so we might not even have the information. We might hear about it from a cousin or an aunt or an uncle, or something that was said in our family home when we were young. But many times, Gene, we don't have the information. But that information exists in our trauma language. So I've learned to look for what I call core language or trauma language. Like this woman who had the language, I'll harm my baby. And that trauma language that showed up in her symptoms after a specific event. This trauma language or these anxieties or our symptoms, it's all a specific type of language that's talking to us. And it lives in our traumas that we repeat, and it lives in that language that we speak, and it lives in our behaviors that repeat, and in the destructive choices that we keep repeating in our lives, or the potholes that we continually step in. This type of language, this core language, which is both verbal and physical and non-physical, this language gives us more than a glimpse of what might have happened in our family history, even when we don't know what happened in our family history. The trauma is not only encrypted in our unconscious words that we speak, Gene, it lives in our symptoms and our repeated life choices and our unexplained behaviors. I mean, we have to look at even that guy in Las Vegas. Here's this guy that does the most heinous mass shooting in American history and kills 58 or 59 people. And they can't figure out what happened. Why did this guy do something so terrible? And all we have is a glimpse of his history, but not all of it. We see that his father was a famous bank robber, and the father was on the lam and hidden on the FBI's most wanted list, as the 10 most wanted, and he escapes for jail, and he's away for, they don't catch him for 10 years, and by the time they catch him, he only serves 2 or 3 years at the end of his life. But we don't know if he caused someone's death, or in the generation before that, who caused death, who evaded the law, who killed people. What's happening in this family that keeps repeating, where the father's a bank robber, the son is a mass killer. You get what I'm saying, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
There's a horrible language living in these terrible events in this family. That if it were understood, if this man who did the killing could look at his family history and say, what lives in my history is being at odds with the law, obviously, and doing something terrible. If he had looked at his shadow and worked with his shadow, perhaps something this terrible would have never come about.
So with those two examples, could you talk in kind of a practical way about core language? I think the examples you give are good, but maybe kind of the direct, these are what the pieces are, this is how we can unpack it to kind of discover what the trauma is. Absolutely.
So when a trauma happens, I talked about biological changes. I talked about something called an epigenetic tag or a chemical tag happening inside our DNA that connects with the proteins and the genes turning on and off. But also what happens is clues are left behind in the form of emotionally charged words and sentences, clues that form a breadcrumb trail that when we learn how to follow it can lead us back to a traumatic event in our family history. Traumas that may have been biologically inherited from our parents and our grandparents. When we know how to hear this language, which is what I teach us to do in the book, and I teach us how to become detectives of this core language, uncovering the clues in the words we speak and in the behaviors that repeat, and then making links to where this trauma language originated. When we can link find the missing piece of the puzzle, which is this trauma language or these behaviors that repeat or these symptoms that show up at age 30 or, and I can talk about ages in a minute, that allows the whole, this missing piece of the puzzle that allows the whole picture to come into view. It can give us the context that helps explain why we feel the way that we feel. For example, one of the questions I ask in the book is I ask people to tell their worst fear. One of the way in which I ask it, I say, Gene, for example, what's the worst thing that could happen to you? What's your worst fear if things suddenly fell apart, if things went terribly wrong? You don't have to answer this, but just the answer, as your listeners are now probably beginning to muse, just the answer to that question brings up some material that we don't want to look at. We don't want to look at our worst fear because it's the reason it's our worst fear is because it scares us, and it's frightening if it ever transpired, if it took place in our lives. So, but if we look at it, we're dipping into the shadow parts of ourselves. And for many of us, the worst fear is I'll be alone. There'll be no support. I'll be rejected. As this woman said, I'll harm a child. I'll harm my baby. As someone else might say, I'll go crazy. I'll end up in an institution. In other words, the language that we can drum up that lives in us from traumas in our lifetime or maybe our parents' or grandparents' lifetime, this language is worth looking at. It opens the door into the shadow parts of us that can be very helpful. So we're living responsibly rather than reactively.
And so is there specific words that we're looking for? How do we kind of decode the language itself?
Yeah, I teach that. That would be a whole lesson.
Okay.
But I teach that in the book. We're looking for this emotionally charged language that has the quality of not fitting in the context of our life experience.
Right.
For example, if somebody says a phrase like, I'll do something terrible and I'll hurt someone. And we say to this person, well, have you ever done anything to hurt someone? And this person says to us, Gene, no, but it's always been my fear. The question that you and I are going to ask is, from where does that come? And that allows us to look specifically in a certain direction to somebody who did do something terrible and did harm someone. In fact, I wonder in that shooter's life if something like that existed because he did something terrible and harmed innocent people. So I wonder if in his family somebody did something terrible and harmed innocent people, or innocent people in his family were harmed and he's acting out the other side of it. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
So then, once we have figured out these things that are impacting us in the moment are something that is actually something that has been passed along generationally, how then do we undo that, unknit that, transform that, heal that?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. So the third part of the book I spend in unpacking of that, and then what we do. For example, we've got to have a powerful enough experience to override that trauma response that lives in us. And then, simply put, we need to practice the new feelings and the new sensations of this new experience. And this can be an experience of receiving comfort or support. I'm big on feeling support in our families where maybe none had been given. Mm-hmm. So many of us have had difficult childhoods or difficult parenting, and we didn't feel comfort or support. So it's important to me that we have a way of either giving ourselves comfort or support, or having comfort or support from our family where maybe there was none, or developing feelings of compassion or gratitude where we don't feel much. Ultimately, any experience that allows us to feel strength or peace inside, this is what we're going for. And the idea is to steal traction away from the highly efficient trauma cycle that lives in our brain. So the midbrain, really, the amygdala, and what we need to do is have an experience that's different than that trauma cycle, that hyper vigilant state of suffering. We need to do something different, which is to have experiences that engage other areas of the brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex, where we can integrate this new experience and our brains can change. So literally, I teach how to have these new experiences and then how to practice them. Because when we practice them, when we revisit the feelings and the sensations associated with this new experience, not only can the structures in our brains begin to rewire, which is, how we have neuroplastic change or new neural pathways happening. There's two segments of the brain that start to connect through the dendrites of where we are having a positive experience that begins to override the negative experience, and then two neuronal structures start to wire together. Not only does that begin to happen, but by practicing the feelings and the sensations associated with the new experience, we're also stimulating the release of feel-good neurotransmitters in our brain, like serotonin and dopamine, or even feel-good hormones in our body, like estrogen or oxytocin, and even how our genes express can be affected. In fact, the very genes involved in the body's stress response or inflammation response can begin to function in a new way. And I guess the way I say it is this new experience, we've got to install it in our body so we can create neuroplastic change.
And so then are we also, and I understand the way that neuroplasticity happens and that changes in the brain, are we also able to measure epigenetically the change of releasing something or transforming something, or is that not something that shows up until the next generation?
So there's some interesting research that's come out of the Brain Research Institute in Zurich, the same people who the previous study that I mentioned, where they traumatized mice in their early lifetime, but then they changed their environment to a positive and rewarding environment, and found that these mice not only began to have changed or improved brain function, but they weren't as likely to pass forward the trauma response. So not only did the mice's brains change by having a positive experience, which is what you and I have been talking about, this idea of having positive experiences that we practice. The mice were now living in an unstressed environment, and they began to improve and were less likely to pass forward the stress response.
Awesome. Well, cool. Mark, thank you very much for your time today. This is just super fascinating stuff.
Oh, thank you for having me, Gene.
So I hope you found that conversation as fascinating as I did. I really appreciate how generous Mark was with his time, and it's really useful stuff when we're looking at why things show up. Because you can be in a situation, and I've certainly had lots of clients in situations where they are having a visceral emotional response to something, and there is no memory. There is nothing to go back to. And as little as 12 years ago, we didn't know any of this stuff. And the fact that we can now see that this is showing up because of things that happened in previous generations is really exciting, because it gives us the opportunity to approach it in a new way. Based on the information that was shared, I have 3 ideas that I think you can implement right away when you are tapping. Idea number 1 is to give yourself permission not to know why it is you are the way you are. I've had lots of clients who slow the healing process because they are so hell-bent on finding the initial cause for the trauma or the response that they're having. And it makes sense that we want to do this because on a subconscious level, there's a part of us that thinks if I know why I am this way, then I can prevent it from happening again in the future. But if in a circumstance like this, you're never going to know why you are this way because you don't have the memory, then you're going to prevent yourself from healing because you're going to be looking for this answer. And most people don't do this in a conscious way. It happens on a subconscious level that we resist the healing itself because there's a part of us that just wants to know why. So one of the things that I have incorporated into the beginning of my tapping sessions when I'm working by myself and I'm trying to unpack something is I tap on phrases like, I give myself permission to know that I do not need to know the root cause of this particular issue. That healing and transformation can happen without that information, and I am open to not needing to know that information for any reason. At the exact same time, if my system does need to know why I am this way, I believe that information will come forward in this tapping session. So by tapping in that fashion, what I'm doing is I am setting myself up to be easier with the healing process and allowing myself to release things in a way that is much more natural. So the next time you sit down to tap, just begin like that. So if the issue you are tapping on is something that is genetic and you're never going to know, it's allowing the system space to do the healing that it needs to do. The second thing that I find really useful from this information is we could find ourselves in a situation when we hear this that all of a sudden we start putting blame on someone else for passing along trauma to us. And it can create this emotional response of wanting to fight back, and it can create the emotional response of being a victim because someone else has given us this thing. And so I find it really useful to tap on things around where I am not holding the previous generation responsible for the work for the trauma that has shown up. And it could look something like, the generations before me have done the best that they could. And I am sure they would do things differently if they could. And some of those choices have created the circumstance that I am in. They've created what my daily life looks like, and they've created some of the beliefs I carry with me. I give myself permission to release and let go of these beliefs without releasing and let going of the people who have given me the beliefs. I give myself permission to release the beliefs without blaming them, and I give myself permission to release the beliefs knowing that I can because they are no longer useful. And again, doing something like this at the beginning of a tapping session is a good setup to put yourself into a position for real healthy transformation. The third thing that I find really fascinating that we can learn from this and how we can tap on this is recognizing the fact that when we do healing, we can imagine the healing that we're passing backwards down our generational chain. I one time was doing some generation work with one of my clients, and the way she described it was she imagined the healing power passing back through the family tree, as in went back generation by generation. Each generation started applauding, and so the applause got louder and louder and louder the further it went back as she was doing that healing for them. And so I like to tap on this idea. It looks something like, I recognize the fact that as I do this healing, I'm not only doing this healing for myself, but I'm doing it for the generations that came before me. And as I release, that healing power is passing back generation to generation to generation, creating release and healing for all of us. And as that generational healing happens, it makes my burden lighter because I am no longer having to carry it for them, and I'm no longer having to carry it for me. And so I give myself permission to enter into this healing process, not only for me, but all those who came before me. So if you latch onto those three ideas, you can see how easy it is to supercharge and improve the way that you are doing the tapping by allowing yourself to release quicker and putting that healing in context. If you'd like to learn more information about Mark, all you need to do is go to tappingqandapodcast.com, click on the link for episode 291. If you happen to be listening to this on a smartphone or on a tablet, if you go into the show notes, you'll find a link to him, as well as the really amazing book that he has written on this stuff and how you can continue to release the traumas that have been passed on in your DNA. If you have a question, a comment, or something that you would like to see on a future episode, please reach out and let me know. I can always be reached at Gene, Gene, at tappingqna.com. If you're listening inside of the app, click on the contact button in the app. You can send me a voice message or send me an email. If you're on the website, click on the contact button. I love, love, love hearing from you. Some of the best suggestions, including this particular interview, came from recommendations from people just like you. Please check out the archive. We have over 350 podcasts now between interviews like this, instructions, tap-along audios. It's waiting for you. It's free of charge. Why are you not taking advantage of this amazing resource? It's sitting there for you. If you know someone in your life who would be interested in what we talked about today, please be our ambassador and pass it along. Don't spam everyone in your inbox, but just send it on to those people who could use something like this. For the Tapping Q&A podcast, this is Gene Monterastelli. I hope you have a great day, and I will talk to you real soon. Bye-bye. The Tapping Q&A podcast is copyright Gene Monterastelli, Tapping Q&A 2016. All views expressed by guests are those of the guests and not necessarily of Gene Monterastelli or Tapping Q&A.